Imagine walking through Victorian London, where history books spoke of empire and industry, but stayed silent about the thousands of women who kept the city's nights alive. Women branded as prostitutes, yet living stories of hunger, courage, and survival that polite society pretended not to see. By day they stitched clothes, pawned shawls, shared stale bread, and cared for children in crowded rooms. And by night they stepped under gas lamps with shawls tightened, reading glances, negotiating coins, enduring danger, and yet laughing together, mocking pompous clients and finding tenderness in the smallest gestures. They carried the contradictions of a world that condemned them while secretly relying on them, bearing illness and judgment with dignity, humor, and resilience. This is not the scandal history painted, but the human truth it buried. And tonight we uncover what Victorian prostitutes really did all day. The forgotten details of survival, compassion, and defiance that shaped London's hidden heartbeat so. Stay with me, because once you hear their story, you'll never see that city the same way again. Victorian London was a city where the streets told a story far different from the history books, where thousands of women lived lives that polite society refused to acknowledge yet depended on in secret, where alleyways and gaslit doorways hid. The daily routines of prostitutes whose existence was simultaneously condemned and consumed, and if you lean close enough, you could almost hear the echo of their footsteps on cobblestones. The faint laughter carried over fog, the whispered negotiations that disappeared into night, and the sighs that blended with the sound of horse carriages rattling by. This is the hidden rhythm of their world, one in which the city breathed through them, even as it tried to deny their presence. And tonight, as you lie in bed, with your blanket pulled close, the room perhaps dimly lit by a small lamp, or maybe only the glow of the screen, soft rain tapping against the window, or the hum of distant traffic forming a modern kind of lullaby. I invite you to drift into their forgotten hours, to wander their days and nights as if you were quietly walking beside them through foggy streets where secrets were currency. Take a slow breath, let your body relax, notice how your shoulders drop as if the weight of the day is loosening, and as you listen, feel how the story is not rushing anywhere but moving softly, like mist over the Thames, lingering with details so that each moment can unfold gently. Before we begin, let me whisper a simple reminder. Subscribe to our channel so that you do not miss these nights of history told differently. History softened into stories for rest. History that carries curiosity like a candle in darkness. And as you listen, let us know in the comments, where are you listening from? What time is it there? Are you under warm covers? Or sitting quietly by yourself at night, perhaps with tea cooling beside you? These are the small rituals of presence, connecting your world to theirs, across time, across silence. And so, let us step into the city, into London around the year 1850, where the fog curls like a curtain across the streets, where the lamps glow faint but steady, and where every doorway could hold a story you were never taught in school, because history liked to talk about the empire, about industry, about gentlemen in top hats and ladies in carriages, but it rarely whispered what happened after dusk, when women in worn dresses walked slowly under the gaslights, waiting, watching, surviving. Imagine the narrow lanes off Whitechapel, the wooden shutters on windows leaning crooked, the smell of coal smoke heavy in the air mixed with horse dung and roasted chestnuts sold on corners. And there, among the clatter and smoke, a young woman leans against the lamppost, her shawl thin, her shoes worn, her hair pinned but already loosening in the damp air. She does not look like the novels describe. No velvet, no diamonds, just threadbare clothes, hands reddened from cold, and eyes that shift between hardness and exhaustion. She is one of thousands, a prostitute in Victorian England. And her day has already been long before the night even began. For these women, the morning did not mean luxury, but often hunger, not leisure, but calculation, where every penny spent on bread or rent had to be weighed against what could be earned when the sun fell. Many lived in shared lodgings, cramped rooms and lodging houses where beds were rented by the night, where the smell of sweat and damp plaster filled the air, where privacy did not exist, and where sometimes a woman had to share a mattress with another stranger if she could not pay enough for her own. They rose with stiff backs, sore from the uneven straw, and dressed quickly, sometimes reusing the same garments day after day, patching them with whatever scraps could be found, because appearance meant survival, yet even the illusion of neatness was often a struggle. Outside, the city was alive with workers hurrying to factories, shopkeepers lifting shutters, costermongers pushing carts of vegetables, and yet woven among this bustle were the prostitutes, moving quietly, blending in, sometimes pretending to be seamstresses, laundresses, or servants on errands, for daylight was dangerous. Daylight could expose them to police, to judgmental eyes, to the charities that claimed to rescue, but often punished them. Their daily routine was not one of constant scandal, but of ordinary survival, fetching water from pumps, washing clothes in cold basins, queuing at bakeries for stale bread, or trying to pawn a shawl for a few coins. Some worked in brothels, with madams who controlled their time, but many more were streetwalkers, independent yet vulnerable, carrying their bodies as both livelihood and burden. The strange reality is that much of their day was not spent in glamorous debauchery, but in waiting, calculating, hiding. Imagine her walking through the markets at Covent Garden, pretending to examine fruit she cannot afford, listening to the poor. Cries of sellers advertising plums, apples, fish, flowers, while her mind is on the evening ahead, wondering if tonight she will find a gentleman kind enough to pay well, or a drunk sailor who may leave bruises. And here lies a detail history books rarely mention. Many Victorian prostitutes spent more time avoiding disease than indulging in pleasure, because syphilis and gonorrhea spread like wildfire in those alleys, and women invented quiet rituals to keep themselves alive, washing with vinegar, carrying herbs, whispering prayers as they bathed in cold water, hoping it would be enough. Some even chewed clothes to hide the smell of drink or sweat when they approached potential clients, because seduction was often a fragile performance, less about beauty than about convincing someone that they were desirable enough to pay for. And yet, in the same breath, these women laughed together, joked in whispers, mocked the absurdity of men who boasted of wealth but haggled over pennies, because humor was survival, and sometimes the only way to soften the darkness was to find small absurdities in the night. Picture them gathered in a small lodging room, 3 or 4 sharing bread, one teasing another for flirting with a policeman, laughter echoing briefly before quiet returns, because behind every giggle was the knowledge that the streets were dangerous, that violence could be sudden, that a wrong client could mean disappearance. And so, as you listen, notice how their day was not what you might expect, less about sin, more about survival, less about scandal, more about small decisions, each one a matter of endurance. The city itself seemed to conspire against them. Laws that branded them as criminals, neighbors who turned away, churches that preached about fallen women yet quietly relied on their existence to uphold the morality of others. The paradox of Victorian prostitutes was that they were everywhere and nowhere visible in streets, invisible in records, condemned in speeches, necessary in silence. Let this image settle into your mind. The gaslight flickers, a carriage wheel splashes through a puddle, the fog thickens, and a woman pulls her shawl tighter as she prepares for another long night. She is not a ghost, though history treated her like one. She is flesh, she is hunger, she is laughter, she is fear, and her story, untold, waits quietly for us to listen as we drift deeper into her world, softer, slower, until the city itself feels like a lullaby of footsteps and whispers, carrying us gently into the unseen hours of Victorian life. Morning in Victorian London often began with the sharp sound of church bells, the clip of hooves on stone, and the shuffle of workers heading into factories. For prostitutes, the dawn did not always mean rest. Many returned to their lodgings as the first gray light spread across rooftops, carrying the fatigue of the night and the few coins they managed to earn. The city was already awake by the time they found their way back to narrow alleys and cramped staircases. In the small rented rooms where several women might share a single bed, the air was heavy with smoke, damp walls, and the faint scent of gin. They laid their shawls over chairs to dry, slipped off shoes that pinched their feet, and unpinned hair that smelled faintly of coal dust and perfume. Rest did not always come easily. Hunger and noise often kept their eyes open, and the clamor of carts below or the cries of milk sellers reminded them that while the rest of the city marched toward work, their survival would depend on waiting for night again. Daytime was both a curse and a necessity. To walk openly meant risk of arrest, for the police often targeted women who looked idle or suspicious. Yet to stay hidden meant no chance of securing food or mending clothing. Some sought small errands to appear respectable, carrying baskets. To markets as if they were servants buying for employers, though the coins they clutched were their own last pennies. Others went to pawnbrokers, offering rings, shawls, or even a single shoe in exchange for bread. Many turned to laundry work during daylight hours. It was grueling labor, washing sheets and shirts in cold water that chapped their hands until skin cracked, but it offered a cover of decency. A woman who could claim she was a laundress stood less chance of being accused as a prostitute. Even as she returned to the same streets by evening, the city was never still. Costermongers shouted. Prices for oranges and onions. Chimney sweeps blackened with soot ran errands for pennies. Boys sold newspapers, their headlines screaming about political scandals, wars abroad, or murders close to home. Women of the streets moved among them quietly, trying to appear unnoticed, and yet everyone knew who they were. Respectable women. Crossed the road rather than brush shoulders with them. Clergymen offered pamphlets warning of moral ruin. Moral ruin. At the same time, wealthy men in dark coats might slip coins into their palms when no one was watching. It was this strange paradox shunned by day, sought by night, that shaped their entire existence. Meals, when they could be had, were simple. A loaf of bread shared between three. A bit of cheese if luck was kind. Sometimes only tea without sugar, sipped slowly to make it last. Those who found better fortune the night before might buy meat pies or oysters, which were cheap and plentiful. At the time, oysters were not yet a delicacy of the rich, but the common food of the poor, eaten in smoky taverns where women mixed with dock workers and sailors. They ate quickly, not for pleasure but for strength. Hunger was a shadow that never left. To be full was rare. To be faint with emptiness was common. Illness followed them like fog. The damp rooms, the lack of nutrition, and the strain of constant exposure made even small ailments dangerous. A cough might linger into fever. Cuts from worn. Shoes could fester. And there was always the fear of venereal disease, whispered about in hushed tones. Many women created their own remedies. Some washed with vinegar or alum. Others chewed herbs. Few had money for doctors, and those who did often found themselves judged rather than treated. Hospitals and charitable institutions sometimes admitted them, but often with the condition of repentance, of renouncing their lives, as though illness itself were punishment for sin. Still, there was resilience. Between the struggles, there were small acts of care. One woman sharing her bread with another who had none. Another lending her comb to tidy hair before stepping out at dusk. They formed communities in the shadows, sisterhoods bound not by blood, but by shared survival. Laughter filled those cramped rooms, laughter that seemed almost defiant, mocking the cruelty of a world that condemned them. They told jokes about clients, exaggerated the manners of pompous men, or teased one another for finding a rare gentleman who was generous rather than harsh. These moments were fleeting but precious. They reminded each other that they were alive, not merely ghosts in the city's underbelly. London itself was a stage of contradictions. Grand theaters with velvet curtains and gas chandeliers stood only streets away from alleys reeking of sewage. The same men who applauded actresses in glittering gowns might an hour later slip into narrow passageways seeking company from women in patched dresses. Newspapers wrote of morality, yet filled pages with titillating stories of scandals that made fortunes for printers. Respectability and desire danced together in silence, and prostitutes were caught in the middle, both despised and depended upon Dot. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the women began to prepare for the coming night. Preparation was a ritual. Dresses were brushed, even if threadbare. Faces were washed, hair pinned carefully. Some used bits of chalk or lead-based powders to pale their skin, mimicking the fashion of the wealthy. Rouge was dabbed on cheeks. Lips were darkened with crushed berries or wax-tinted red. These touches were more than vanity. They were armor. Each gesture transformed fatigue into presentation, exhaustion into allure. They looked into cracked mirrors, adjusting shawls, whispering small prayers that the night ahead would bring enough. To keep them alive another day. Dot outside, the fog thickened again. Gas lamps flickered into life. The city exhaled with a new kind of energy, different from the day's labor, filled now with music spilling from taverns, laughter echoing from gin, shops, and the shuffle of footsteps seeking distraction. For the prostitutes of Victorian London, this was the moment when survival once more depended on stepping into the night, into the unpredictable, into a world that judged them and yet could not exist without them. Dot, as twilight deepened across London, the rhythm of the city shifted once more, drawing prostitutes from their lodgings into the narrow veins of streets that pulsed with anticipation. The air grew heavier with coal smoke and the tang of gin as taverns filled with men who had coins to spend and tempers shaped by drink. For women, the evening began with a careful balance between visibility and caution. To stand too boldly risked unwanted attention from police patrols eager to make an example, while too much hesitation could mean an empty stomach the following day. Many positioned themselves beneath flickering gas lamps, where light softened their features and shadows could disguise exhaustion. They learned the art of standing still yet alert, of smiling just enough to invite conversation without appearing desperate. The posture itself was a performance, honed over years of necessity, a dance of glances and gestures that could make the difference between a night of wages and a night of hunger. The men who approached them were not always strangers. Some were regulars, dock workers who returned from ships with sea salt still clinging to their clothes, or clerks with ink-stained hands who sought distraction from long days of ledgers. Others were soldiers on leave, their boots muddy from drills, their laughter loud and careless. And then there were the gentlemen, their hats polished, their gloves clean, men who spoke in hushed voices and cast nervous glances over their shoulders, fearful of recognition but unwilling to stay away. Each encounter was shaped by negotiation. A few words exchanged under the lamplight, a coin pressed discreetly into a palm, a decision made to step into an alley, a rented room, or the back of a carriage. Violence was always a possibility. Some clients arrived drunk, demanding, quick to anger when denied. Women carried small strategies of protection, a pin hidden in a sleeve, a friend waiting nearby, a careful assessment of mood before agreeing to walk together. Stories of women, found beaten or worse, traveled swiftly through their circles, whispered warnings that lingered like the fog itself. Yet despite the risks, necessity drove them forward. Every night was another chance, another gamble, another test of survival against forces larger than themselves. Brothels offered a different rhythm. Within their walls, order was imposed by madams who controlled both clients and workers. Women, they're often dressed more elaborately, sometimes in gowns provided by the house, their appearances polished to suit the expectations of wealthier patrons. Music played faintly from upstairs rooms, and laughter echoed from parlors where clients sipped brandy before being led away. For some women, brothels offered stability, a roof that was consistent, meals that were certain, even if freedom was diminished. But many others preferred the uncertainty of the streets to the strict rules of madams, who could demand obedience and claim a share of earnings. Independence meant risk, yet it also meant choice, however narrow. The streets themselves were unpredictable, theaters of chance. On one corner, a woman might charm a sailor into parting with more coins than expected, laughing together as though the city itself had softened for a moment. On another, a constable might appear suddenly scattering women into alleys to avoid arrest. The law labeled them as nuisances, as dangers to public morality, yet arrests were often inconsistent, influenced as much by bribes or personal whims as by regulations. The hypocrisy was clear. The same officials who arrested them might seek their company on different nights, the boundary between condemnation and participation blurred by desire. Amid the uncertainty, small rituals became anchors. Some women carried Lucky Charms bits of ribbon, lockets, or even simple buttons that they touched before venturing out, tiny talismans against misfortune. Others formed partnerships, standing together on busy streets, sharing food, watching for danger. These bonds created a fragile network of protection, reminding them they were not entirely alone. Stories were exchanged in whispers, tales of good clients, tales of cruel ones, tales of near escapes. In these retellings, fear softened into resilience, sorrow into memory, and hardship into something that could be endured because it was shared. The city around them never ceased its contradictions. Grand carriages rolled past taverns where men shouted songs until their voices cracked. Wealthy families dined by candlelight behind tall windows, unaware or pretending not to see the women waiting below. The Thames carried both commerce and filth, reflecting the glow of lamps on its surface while concealing the debris of the city's hidden underbelly. Against this backdrop, prostitutes lived in plain sight yet unseen, their presence woven into the very fabric of London, even as society tried to erase them from polite conversation. For some, moments of tenderness slipped through the night. A client who listened rather than demanded. A stranger who offered a meal before anything else. A shared joke that made both laugh despite the transaction. These fragments of humanity reminded women that their lives were more than what the world named them. They were daughters once, sisters, mothers, dreamers. Behind every exchange of coin was a life full of memories and longings that history has too often ignored. As the hours stretched on, fatigue set in. Feet ached from standing. Voices grew hoarse from calling softly into the night. The fog thickened, blurring the edges of lamplight, making every corner feel uncertain. Some women found themselves invited into warmth, into rooms where at least for an hour there was bread, fire, and respite. Others returned empty-handed, their shawls pulled tighter, their bodies colder, their thoughts heavy with worry about how to pay for another bed at the lodging house. The city offered no guarantees. It only offered more nights, more chances, more risks, and the constant demand to keep moving, keep smiling, keep enduring. And so, the night wore on, one encounter after another, footsteps echoing over cobblestones, whispers dissolving into fog, until the boundary between survival and despair blurred, leaving only the quiet determination to face whatever the next moment might bring. As dawn slowly returned to London, the women who had spent the night on its streets often carried themselves back to their lodgings with steps heavy from fatigue and thoughts clouded by uncertainty. For some, the night had been profitable, a handful of coins in their pocket enough to pay for rent, food, and perhaps a few small comforts like a ribbon or soap. For others, the hours had yielded little, and they faced the humiliation of begging, the lodging house keeper to wait another day, or the desperation of pawning yet another possession. The city in daylight was no less demanding than it had been in darkness. The markets opened with cries from vendors, and the streets filled again with workers. Prostitutes navigated these spaces cautiously, weaving between respectable women with baskets and men hurrying to their trades, aware of eyes that judged but pretended not to see. The hypocrisy of London was sharp in the morning air. Those who had sought them in the night walked briskly past without acknowledgement, adjusting their coats and avoiding recognition, as though a glance could betray a secret shared only ours. Before inside the lodging houses, mornings carried their own rituals. Women washed themselves as best they could in basins of cold water, rubbing their faces with rough cloths until their skin stung, combing hair with broken tooth combs, and patching garments with worn thread. These were not idle preparations, but necessary acts of survival. To appear too unkempt meant losing even the small advantage of first impressions when night returned. Clothes were mended again and again, stockings darned until the fabric was more repair than original, shoes patched with scraps of leather from discarded pairs found in markets. The details of presentation mattered. A shawl arranged just so could disguise a frayed dress. A bit of powder or rouge could brighten a face that carried fatigue like a shadow. These rituals gave women a sense of control in lives where so much else was uncertain. The daytime also brought the presence of charities and reform societies, organizations that sought to rescue women from prostitution, but often imposed rigid moral expectations. Some ran homes where women were trained in sewing, laundry, or domestic work, offering food and shelter, but demanding strict obedience, repentance, and the erasure of past lives. For some, these places offered relief from the streets, a way to escape the endless cycle of risk and hunger. For many others, they felt like prisons, stripping away autonomy under the guise of salvation. Women whispered about these institutions with mixed voices, fear, resentment, gratitude, and bitterness mingled together. The paradox of rescue was clear. To be saved often meant to surrender freedom. And yet, in the middle of these struggles, there were moments of ordinary domesticity that softened the harshness of survival. In shared kitchens, women boiled tea, the steam rising in small clouds that warmed cold fingers. They shared bread bought from nearby stalls, dipped crusts into wheat broth, and spoke in low tones about the events of the night. Conversations drifted from warnings about dangerous clients to gossip about neighbors, from laughter over small absurdities to silence when fatigue settled too heavily for words. In these communal spaces, bonds were formed, fragile yet resilient. Friendships acted as lifelines, weaving women together in a net of support that offered at least some protection against the indifference of the city. The police remained an ever-present shadow. Patrols through the day and night often targeted. Prostitutes for loitering, for being a nuisance, for no reason beyond their presence on the streets. Arrest meant fines, time in cells, or being marked in records as common prostitutes, a label that followed them like a scar. And yet, the same officers who dragged them into stations could sometimes be seen slipping into brothels, taking advantage of the very women they accused. The law was less about justice and more about power, and women learned quickly that survival often required navigating these contradictions with care. Some carried small coins to bribe when threatened with arrest. Others cultivated fragile alliances with particular officers, offering favors in exchange for leniency. It was a dangerous balance, one that could collapse at any moment. Disease loomed over everything. Venereal illness spread quickly, and so too did consumption, typhus, and fevers that ravaged lungs and bodies already weakened by hunger and cold. Public health debates raged in newspapers and parliament, but the burden fell on women who had little choice but to risk exposure. The Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s marked them as scapegoats, subjecting them to forced medical examinations that humiliated and punished without offering real care. Men remained largely exempt from blame. The injustice was sharp and women knew it. They carried the weight of stigma in addition to the physical cost of illness, and yet they endured, finding ways to continue when others would have collapsed. Strange. Details of survival colored their lives in ways history rarely mentions. Some chewed raw parsley to freshen breath before meeting a client. Others stitched hidden pockets inside skirts to carry coins safely. A few adopted stray cats, not just for companionship, but to catch the rats that infested lodging houses. Humor too remained a tool of resilience. Women laughed at the clumsiness of certain men, joked about the endless sermons that painted them as monsters, and teased each other about small victories, like convincing a client to pay more or escaping. An evening without harm. These fragments of light threaded themselves through the darkness, making existence bearable. As afternoon turned again toward dusk, the city shifted into another rhythm. The gas lamps hissed as they were lit. Shopkeepers closed shutters. The sound of fiddles and voices drifted from taverns. Women once more prepared themselves for the night, brushing dresses, repinning hair, dabbing powder on faces, and slipping. shawls around shoulders. Each movement was familiar, almost ritualistic, a quiet acknowledgement that the cycle continued. London itself seemed to breathe with them, exhaling fog, inhaling anticipation, holding within its lungs both grandeur and misery. And through it all, the prostitutes of Victorian England walked steadily, carrying laughter, hunger, fear, and resilience together. Their stories woven into the city's heart, even if history refused to give them names. The music halls opened, like bright pockets of warmth against the damp, and many women drifted toward them at night, not only to find clients, but to borrow the glow of laughter for a moment and remember what it felt like to be an audience instead of a spectacle. Velvet curtains rose on comic singers, cross-dressed performers, and sentimental ballads about sailors far from home, and the crowd answered with tinny applause, clinks of glasses, and the occasional whistle that sailed up to the rafters like a small wayward bird. Women watched these stages with professional attention. A lively chorus could loosen a room, soften the pride of a man who had come to spend nothing, and turn a conversation toward generosity. A sad song could make a sober clerk place an extra coin in a palm, as if the music had reminded him of a promise he had no words to keep. The air smelled of spilled gin, damp wool, and grease paint. Boots squeaked on wood. Between the jokes and encores, negotiations took shape along the back walls, gentle as the turning of a coat collar, quick as the glance that says yes without admitting anything aloud. The women knew how to appear casual while counting prospects, how to laugh at a punchline and in the same breath calculate how many pennies still stood between them and the week's rent. They observed the room the way sailors read the sea, feeling where the tide ran strongest and where the undertow of trouble might pull them under dock. Not every evening led to a room or a carriage. Sometimes the work was less visible, but just as demanding. A woman might spend an hour simply walking beside a man, listening while he rehearsed the speech he could not give his wife, or confess a small act of cowardice he had never named aloud. In those minutes, she became a quiet harbor. She nodded at the right times, let silences open like gentle doorways, and knew when to fold a strand of hair behind her ear to signal that she was still present. He would pay for the privilege of being human where no one could judge him, and she would leave with her dignity folded carefully under her shawl. There was an art to this soft presence, a dignity made of patience rather than pride, and many women mastered it as surely as any. Craft. Wardrobes required ingenuity that felt almost like alchemy. A dress that had lost its sheen could be revived with a rag and the tiniest smear of oil. Too much would make it vulgar. Just enough made it catch the lamplight like a whisper. Shoes were rubbed with stove blacking until they shone and holes were patched from the inside with scraps of leather cut from the tongues of ruined boots. A few kept a stub of red wax that touched the lips, a sliver of blue paper to make the whites of the eyes brighter in poor light, and a drop of cheap cologne that promised roses but suggested something closer to sugared lemons. Hairpins were counted, like coins. A woman without enough pins learned to twist a bun that would hold through wind and worry. A shawl did the work of a wardrobe, able to suggest modesty or invitation, depending on how it was knotted. There was pride in these preparations. No one needed to see the stitching to understand the skill. The mirror chipped at the corners, silvering gone at the edges, returned a face that could still choose how to be seen. Safety was a discipline rather than a mood. Friends arranged. Signals before stepping into the night. A handkerchief looped around a wrist meant wait for me at the corner. A cough that sounded too deliberate meant stay close. Women memorized the faces of sympathetic barkeepers and coffee stall men who would look the other way and then look back at precisely the right moment. Some carried pins sharp enough to sting a drunk into awareness without provoking a fight. Others learned which stair tread squeaked and which window stuck, because the small facts of a building could be the difference between danger and departure. Stories of women who disappeared were never told with theatrical flair. They were recited plainly, as one might recite the weather, and the discipline of listening to those stories was a quiet promise to each other that Information could keep them alive. Children were a tenderness that could not always be kept. Some women sent infants to nurse with country wet nurses, buying time with coins they could not spare in hopes of returning. For them, when the ledger of survival finally balanced, others placed babies with a neighbor who had steady day work, paying by the week, and trusting that the kindness of an extra slice of bread could hold a child until evening. There were tragedies, whispered like prayers with the vows rounded by grief. A baby farmer who took 2 infants and returned none. A foundling left at the steps of a parish church, wrapped in a man's shirt, because it was the best cloth in the house. Yet there were also scenes that warmed even the coldest rooms. A toddler asleep under a counter at a coffee stall while his mother worked nearby. A child learning to thread a needle beside women who mended dresses. The little fingers. Steady with purpose. When a woman could afford it, rare, but not impossible, she visited her child in a small house at the edge of the city, carrying a paper parcel of sweet biscuits and a scarf she had donned at midnight, and the reunion folded itself around them. Like a shawl that finally lay right, illness rarely arrived with a declaration. It drifted in as a cough that would not leave, as a stiffness in the joints that made climbing stairs feel like carrying water in a leaking pail. The lock hospitals promised treatment for venereal disease, though the price of admission was often the humiliation of examination and the surrender of agency. The Contagious Diseases Acts turned women into suspects by default, and the shame attached to the very act of seeking help sometimes left them to invent gentler cures in dim rooms. Warm water steeped with chamomile, bread soaked in milk, vinegar, rinses, mustard plasters that burned a little, but made them feel as though they were doing something, anything, to stay in command of their own skin. A few charitable doctors offered real care without sermon. Their names moved quietly across the city like contraband hope. Women remembered the streets that led to those surgeries the way one remembers a safe path through fog dot. It was a language that never found its way into newspapers. It changed from street to street, a bright private patter of slang and sideways glances that made commerce less naked and company more precise. A gentle cove was better than a rough, a stiff. Could be a policeman or a drunk who would not bend to reason. And a kind night meant the weather and the earnings had both shown mercy. Names were elastic. A woman might be Mary under the lamp and Margaret in the coffee stall and my dear in a room where it was convenient to be nobody at all. This fluid naming was not deceit but shelter. In a world eager to mark and unmark, they learned to hold their identities like cards. Turning over only what the moment required. Amusements on off nights had to be cheap and portable, and the city obliged. There were penny gaffs where puppets fought dragons, and comic tragedians rolled their RS until even sorrow sounded like a party trick. There were photographic studios that promised a carte de visite portrait for a price a woman could sometimes spare if she had been lucky. To sit still under the black cloth of the camera was to be taken seriously for a full minute, and the small card that emerged bore witness that she had lived in the full dignity of a face. A few tucked those portraits into books, others mailed them to faraway cousins, and some pinned them inside their dresses like a talisman against the city's forgetting. Reading material traveled from hand to hand until the paper went soft at the folds. Penny dreadfuls with villains who met poetic justice, serialized Dickens pulled from newspapers, and sometimes a prayer card pressed into a palm by a woman who meant the blessing even if she could not stay for the sermon. Money moved through their lives like weather arriving suddenly, vanishing just as quickly, and the arithmetic of a week was an art form exercised with pencil nubs and a talent for grace under pressure. Rent took the first bite. Coal took the second. Full pride at what remained. If a woman had earned well, she bought what would last. A better shawl against the wind, a pair of stockings stout enough to be darned many times, soap with a scent that made a room feel briefly like a place of gentility. If she had earned poorly, she learned to love porridge and the kindness of a neighbor who would lend a spoon of tea leaves with the solemnity of a banker. Pawnbrokers were less villains than instruments. A shawl might go into the shop on Monday, return on Thursday, and go back again by Saturday. An economy of cloth and hope that kept winter from biting too deeply. Faith did not always come from pulpits. It often came from the ordinary sacraments of keeping on. A cup of coffee at dawn served by a stall holder who did not ask for payment until later counted as grace. A stranger who stood between a woman and a fist counted as mercy. A night that ended without bruises counted as a quiet miracle. Some women still visited church, leaning their heads on wooden pews and letting the words wash over them like the sound of the river. They prayed for practical things, strength in the knees, a decent client, a chance to send money to a mother in the country. They lit candles when they could, and when they could not, they made do with the glow of a street lamp reflected in a puddle, claiming that small light as if it had been placed there for them. There were households where a woman's presence became a careful habit. A widower who needed the house warmed with the sound of company once each week. A clerk whose loneliness wore a dark groove in his life and who found in conversation the relief that money could not buy. There were arrangements around which no one wrote contracts and everyone kept their peace. A small gift at Christmas. A basket of oranges when the fever passed. A book pressed into her hand with the shy joy of a man who wanted to give something that would not be spent. In these arrangements, the city's cruelty loosened its grip for an hour. The women learned to accept kindness without suspicion when it came dressed as respect, and to return it in the only currency that felt true: attention, steadiness, and a refusal to humiliate a man who had trusted them with his softest voice. On stormy nights, the streets could go quiet in a way that felt almost holy. Rain drummed on canvas awnings and made pearls along the edges of shawls. The lamps haloed themselves. Footsteps softened. Those who still walked did so with a purposeful hush, as if the weather had asked for gentleness. Women took shelter under archways and counted the seconds between lightning and thunder, making a game of the sky. Coffee stalls steamed like small engines. A barkeeper might let a woman stand at the end of the bar where the floor stayed dry, and they would trade stories over the river of their reflections in the polished wood. Some women swore that rain made men kinder, as if even the rich felt a kinship with those who were soaked, and the night would end with the peculiar peace that follows a storm. The workhouses remained a warning rather than a refuge. Everyone knew the smell of them, carbolic and boiled stone, and the weight of their rules. A woman might enter escape cold or hunger, but she often emerged thinner in spirit, because the price of bread, there was a rehearsed repentance that satisfied the ledger but starved the soul. Even so, a few went when the cold bit the bones, and the streets offered only cruelty. They endured the catechisms, the separation of families, the itch of coarse uniforms, and the gaze that turned a person into a problem. When they left, they walked out slowly, as if relearning the use of their own names, and their friends made space for silence before asking how they were. Night after night, the city asked for the same courage and paid with the same coins, and yet life found room to grow. A stray cat adopted an entire staircase and became the unofficial guardian of the second-floor rooms. A music hall comedian discovered that pausing one heartbeat longer before the final line could make even the sternest. Men laughed like boys, and the room would open like a flower. A new girl learned to tie her shawl against the wind in a way that made her look older, and the older women smiled because small mastery is still mastery. And when fatigue pressed too hard on the chest to allow speech, there was always the oldest. Kindness of all. One woman laying a folded cloak over another who had fallen asleep upright in a chair. The gesture so ordinary that no one remarked on it, even as they understood it as a quiet declaration that they would remain a people. However, the city tried to unmake them. Toward morning, when the lamps burned low and the last carriages rattled home, the streets grew transparent. You could see through the city to its bones the arches of bridges, the ribs of market stalls, the long spine of the river, and it seemed possible, just for a breath, that the day to come might begin not with judgment, but with gentler arithmetic. A coffee poured without hurry. a shawl that did not need mending, a room where the window opened easily and the air smelled of soap. Women walked back through the thinning fog with that image folded at the center of their thoughts like a letter. They intended to read again, and the city, indifferent and immense, permitted this quiet hope without either blessing it or tearing it away. Morning light crept into London's narrow streets through a haze of smoke and damp, finding its way into rooms where women stirred slowly from uneasy sleep. The day began not with luxury, but with necessity. Before the city fully woke, some women walked to public pumps to draw water, carrying buckets heavy against their sides, their arms aching from the weight. Others hurried to small markets to buy what food they could, often stale bread or bruised. Vegetables sold cheaply by hawkers eager to empty their baskets before fresh stock arrived. A lucky few who had earned well the night before could afford eggs, cheese, or even a little meat. And these modest meals became feasts when shared among friends in cramped kitchens. The sound of knives scraping against wooden boards, the bubbling of a pot balanced over a small fire, and the soft murmur of conversation wove together into a fragile sense of home. Not all women could rest in the morning. Some turned immediately to secondary work that brought additional pennies, such as sewing or laundry. A dress might be patched for a neighbor, or shirts scrub it until hands reddened from the cold water. Others sat by windows with needles flashing. In the gray light, sewing garments for shops that paid miserly wages, the work tedious yet necessary. These tasks gave cover from suspicion. To be seen working by day helped soften the gaze of neighbors who might otherwise whisper to landlords or police. The line between respectability and condemnation was thin, and appearances mattered as much as truth. Women learned to perform industry, even when exhaustion pressed against their bodies, because survival depended not only on what was earned at night, but on what was seen in daylight. The city's institutions loomed as constant reminders of control. Police courts processed women for loitering or drunkenness, branding them in records that followed long after the fines were paid. Hospitals admitted those too ill to walk, though care was often paired with moral lectures. Charitable homes offered beds in exchange for obedience, teaching trades that kept women dependent rather than free. These places carried both hope and fear, offering shelter yet demanding the price of submission. Many women avoided them until desperation made the choice unavoidable. Independence, even when dangerous, was often clung to with a stubborn pride. To walk the streets with coins in a pocket earned through one's own negotiations, however precarious, felt more human than surrendering to an institution that demanded repentance before bread. The rhythms of the day carried their own moments of tenderness. In shared rooms, women sat close to one another, darning stockings, telling stories, or humming songs that carried memory of better times. A lullaby once sung to a child, a country ballad remembered from fields left long behind, or a hymn learned in church years earlier might surface softly in the stale air, transforming the room for a few minutes into something gentler than survival. Jokes were passed back and forth, laughter bubbling despite hardship. It was humor that stitched the fabric of community, keeping despair from fraying it entirely. A sharp remark about a pompous client, a playful exaggeration about the size of a landlord's nose, or a teasing complaint about the taste of gin became small acts of rebellion against a world determined to grind them down. Health remained fragile. Many women bore coughs that lingered for weeks, skin that bruised easily, stomachs unsettled from poor diet. Remedies were improvised. Vinegar washes, herbal teas brewed from whatever leaves could be purchased cheaply. Mustard plasters laid on aching chests, and poultices made of bread and milk were common attempts at care. Some relied on midwives or wise women who passed knowledge, quietly offering treatment without judgment. These healers operated in shadows, but were trusted more than official doctors who often dismissed or condemned their patients. In this hidden network of knowledge, women shared recipes for survival as carefully as they shared bread. Each secret passed from one to another, like a thread keeping them connected. The economic cycle pressed constantly. Coins earned at night dissolved quickly in the expenses of day. Rent took its share first, demanded by lodging housekeepers who showed little patience for delay. Coal for fires came next, measured in small sacks that barely lasted through cold nights. Food claimed. Whatever remained. Pawnbrokers filled the gaps, taking shawls, boots, or trinkets into their shops and returning them when luck allowed repayment. Items moved in and out of pawn with the regularity of tides, a rhythm of possession and loss that defined survival. The sight of a familiar shawl hanging behind a broker's glass case could sting, but it also carried hope that with a few good nights, it might be reclaimed. Children brought both burden and solace. Those who could not keep them nearby arranged. Care with relatives or neighbors, visiting when possible with small gifts. A paper bag of sweets, a ribbon, or a loaf of bread was carried like treasure to tiny hands waiting eagerly. The moments of reunion, brief though they were, gave meaning to otherwise harsh routines. Other women raised children within the lodging. Houses, balancing them on hips while cooking or mending, tucking them into corners of shared beds at night. Their cries were softened quickly to avoid complaints, but their presence made life more bearable, reminding mothers that their work was not only survival for themselves, but for another life that depended on them. Evenings carried preparation. Dresses were brushed, shoes polished, hair pinned. Rouge was applied sparingly, lips darkened with improvised tints, faces powdered to catch lamplight. These acts were repeated daily, as vital as meals, forming a ritual that transformed fatigue into presentability. Each gesture was both mask and armor. To step into the streets without it was to risk rejection, but with it came at least the possibility of control. Women studied their reflections in cracked mirrors, adjusting shawls and reminding themselves silently of the strength required to face another night. When lamps hissed to life and the city shifted once again, women stepped out into fog that curled around buildings and soft the edges of danger. Taverns filled with noise, carriages rattled along cobblestones, and the shuffle of footsteps quickened. Men sought distraction, and women offered themselves as both company and commodity. Some nights brought kindness, a Clyde who spoke gently or paid fairly. Other nights brought cruelty, drunken tempers, or violence that left bruises hidden beneath shawls. Through it all, the women endured, returning to rooms at dawn with coins clutched tightly, bodies weary, and spirits balanced between despair and determination. This was the rhythm of life that history rarely told. It was not a story of glamour or scandal, but of survival carved out of hardship, of women who endured with resilience, humor, and quiet strength in a city that depended on them while pretending they did not exist. Their footsteps echoed against the stone, blending with the city's endless hum, and their lives, though often unseen, carried the weight of London's nights as surely as the grandest halls or brightest stages. The nights in Victorian London were never entirely dark. Gas lamps glowed faintly, their light blurring through fog that thickened over the cobblestones. For prostitutes, these lamps became both stage and sentinel. Under their yellow haze, every gesture was magnified. A tilt of the head, the flick of a shawl, the faint curve of a smile all carried meaning. Women learned how to use the dim light to their advantage, knowing that too much brightness revealed exhaustion, while shadows could lend mystery. They stood at corners or moved slowly through the streets, always aware of eyes watching, measuring, deciding. Their craft was not simply in offering themselves, but in reading the unspoken needs of strangers, in catching a glance and knowing whether it carried danger, indifference, or possibility. Music spilled into the streets from taverns and gin houses, blurring into laughter and shouts. Sailors returned from ships docked on the Thames, their pockets heavy with wages and their steps unsteady from drink. Clerks in crumpled coats loosened their collars, eager to forget the long hours spent copying. Figures into ledgers. Soldiers swaggered in pairs, boots muddy, voices loud. Among them moved women who had spent the day preparing for this moment. Their clothes carefully arranged, their faces powdered, their courage steadied. Negotiations often began without words. A lingering glance, a man slowing his pace, the woman adjusting her shawl, A few steps together led to whispered terms, the exchange of coins, the decision to vanish into an alley, a rented room, or the back of a waiting carriage. Each choice was measured in seconds, each encounter a risk weighed. Against hunger, danger lingered in every shadow. Violence was not rare but expected. Some men grew rough when drink clouded their judgment. Others sought to prove their dominance in ways that left bruises hidden beneath clothing. Women spoke of these dangers, in hushed voices, warning one another, creating a quiet network of survival. A gesture at the corner of a street, a phrase muttered under breath, could be a warning to avoid a certain man or to stay close to a friend. Safety was not guaranteed, but solidarity offered a fragile shield. Women watched for one another, waiting. At corners, listening for footsteps that should have returned, but had not. When one disappeared, silence fell heavy, and the city seemed colder, as though the fog itself mourned. Brothels provided a different rhythm. Within their walls, candles glowed in sconces, curtains muffled the outside world, and madams ruled with stern efficiency. Women there dressed more richly, often in gowns provided by the house. Clients drank brandy in parlors, listening to music or idle conversation before being led upstairs. For some women, this environment offered safety from the unpredictability of the streets. The walls and rules provided structure. Meals were guaranteed and earnings, though shared, were reliable. Yet this security came at the cost of freedom. Madams controlled who worked, who rested, who earned, and who was cast out. Many women preferred the uncertainty of the streets, where at least the choices, however narrow, were their own. Independence, even when dangerous, felt like dignity. The hypocrisy of the city was always visible. By day, newspapers printed sermons on morality, condemning prostitutes as threats to the health of the nation. By night, many of the same readers sought their company, slipping coins into palms, whispering their addresses, arranging secret meetings. Clergymen preached about sin while quietly visiting brothels. Policemen arrested women in the morning and sought their favors at night. Respectable society kept its distance in public while depending on their existence in private. The contradiction weighed heavily on the women themselves. They bore the burden of shame and punishment while men moved freely, their reputations largely untouched. Small rituals carried women through these contradictions. Some carried charms sewn into hems, bits of ribbon, coins rubbed smooth from years of handling, or locks of hair tied with thread. Others developed superstitions, believing a certain corner brought better luck, or that beginning the night with a song hummed softly would change fortune. These rituals mattered because they gave a sense of control where little existed. When survival depended on chance, small acts of belief became anchors. There were evenings when kindness surprised them. A client who listened rather than demanded, who shared stories of his own struggles, who pressed extra coins into a hand without expectation. A tavern keeper who offered a free bowl of stew when the night had been unkind. A fellow woman who shared her bed on a freezing night so that another might not sleep on the floor. These gestures, small but deeply felt, carved out spaces of humanity within a world that too often denied it. They reminded women that life was not only endurance but also the possibility of gentleness. The sounds of the night blended into a lullaby of hardship and resilience. Carriages rattled, boots clicked, laughter rose and fell. Bells from distant churches marked the passing hours. Women walked through it all, their footsteps steady, their shawls drawn close, their voices weaving into the fabric of the city. They endured hunger, illness, judgment, and violence, yet they continued because each morning demanded coins for rent, food, and fire. Their lives were not the scandalous tales told in whispers by polite society, but the ordinary struggle of survival, lived with courage, humor, and quiet grace. When dawn returned, the lamps dimmed, the fog lifted, and the city resumed its daily rhythm. The women returned to their rooms, weary but unbroken, carrying with them the memory of another night survived. They laid coins on tables, unpinned their hair, washed their faces in cold water, and rested in beds that creaked under the weight of exhaustion. For a few hours, they slept while London bustled outside, holding within their dreams both the sorrow and the resilience of lives. Lived in the shadows, yet woven into the city's heart, the lodging houses of Victorian London carried their own peculiar symphony, one that began each evening as women returned from markets or prepared for the night ahead. Doors creaked on rusted hinges, staircases groaned beneath tired steps, and voices floated through thin walls. A woman humming while brushing her hair was joined by the murmur of another counting coins beneath her breath. Somewhere a kettle hissed, spilling steam into rooms that smelled of damp plaster and coal smoke. The atmosphere was crowded yet strangely intimate. Privacy was rare, but companionship softened the hardness of survival. In these lodgings, lives intertwined in ways that history books rarely pause to notice. Beds were shared when rent fell short, meals stretched thin to feed more than one mouth, laughter allowed to echo even when sorrow weighed heavily. The rhythm of these houses was survival, woven together with small acts of care. Evenings began with preparation. Shawls were shaken free of dust, dresses brushed until their fabric carried at least a suggestion of dignity, and hair pinned carefully with a handful of hairpins that could be afforded. Faces were washed in cold water drawn from the pump, rouge dabbed sparingly on cheeks, lips tinted with improvised colors made from berries or wax. Each gesture was deliberate, part of a ritual repeated daily. These were not acts of vanity so much as armor, a way of presenting a self that might withstand the judgmental gaze of society and the calculating gaze of clients. A woman looking at her reflection in a cracked mirror understood that what she wore was not simply clothing, but the thin line between rejection and survival. The streets outside pulsed with contrast. Carriages clattered past, carrying gentlemen to theaters or private clubs. Workers spilled out of taverns with laughter that turned quickly into shouts. Hawkers called out late bargains, selling pies, roasted chestnuts, or penny pamphlets filled with lurid tailies. Among all this movement stood the women, poised beneath gas lamps, their presence both obvious and unseen. They knew how to draw attention, without appearing to ask for it, how to suggest rather than declare, how to lean just enough into lamplight so that tired eyes appeared softer and shadows disguised hunger. Their craft was not only physical, but psychological. They read gestures, sensed hesitations, and adjusted their approach in ways that could not be taught in books, but were learned through endless nights on the streets. Encounters varied. Some men approached timidly, speaking in whispers as though ashamed even of their own footsteps. Others came boldly, demanding attention with heavy voices and heavier hands. A few sought only companionship, someone to listen to words they could not, speak to wives or colleagues. The transactions were simple and appearance coins exchanged, time given, but beneath them ran layers of complexity. Every agreement carried risk, every smile masked calculation, every moment balanced between danger and necessity. Women carried their experiences like invisible maps, guiding them through conversations and decisions with instincts honed by hardship. Dangers were constant. Violence erupted quickly in alleys or rooms where walls were too thin to offer real protection. Stories of women beaten or worse traveled quickly, whispered in corners of lodging houses, shared as warnings between friends. Survival required vigilance. Some women carried pins in their sleeves, sharp enough to pierce skin and startle a man back to his senses. Others relied on alliances, watching for one another at corners, waiting in the glow of lamplight until a companion returned. A cough, a phrase, a glance, all could serve as signals. In these small codes, trust was built, and though the city remained hostile, solidarity carved out pockets of safety. Disease hung over their lives like an invisible fog. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and countless unnamed fevers crept into their bodies, stealing health with a slow cruelty. Remedies were improvised. Vinegar washes, alum powders, herbal brews whispered about by midwives, and prayers spoken over basins of cold water. Few could afford doctors, and those who could often face judgment instead of care. Hospitals and charities admitted them reluctantly, demanding repentance as if illness itself were proof of sin. Women bore the weight of this stigma in silence, continuing to walk the streets even when fever burned their skin or bones ached with weariness. To stop was to starve. To endure was the only choice. And yet, within these hardships, humor survived. In the dim corners of lodging houses, women teased one another about clumsy clients, mimicked the pompous accents of men who boasted about wealth but argued over pennies, or joked about the absurdity of moral pamphlets written by men who could not keep their own vows. Laughter, though brief, lifted spirits. It was a reminder that life was not entirely consumed by despair, that joy could be found even in small absurdities. The jokes, sharp and clever, formed a language of resilience. Through them, women reminded each other that they were more than the name society gave them. The city's contradictions grew sharper as night deepened. Wealth and poverty rubbed shoulders in every street. Gentlemen slipped out of theaters with fine coats brushing against the rags of beggars. Clerks who lived by ledgers drank gin beside sailors with stories of distant seas. Prostitutes navigated among them all, simultaneously scorned and desired, condemned and sought. They carried the paradox of a society that depended on their existence while pretending to despise it. To walk through London at night was to see this contradiction laid bare, illuminated by flickering lamps and blurred by mist dotting quieter hours. When taverns emptied and carriages grew fewer, the city took on an eerie stillness. Footsteps echoed more clearly. The Thames, dark and slow, reflected faint glimmers of light. Women who remained on the streets at these hours felt the weight of solitude. They wrapped shawls tighter, scanned shadows carefully, and kept moving because stillness carried danger. And yet there was also beauty. The silence revealed the architecture of the city in a different light. The arches of bridges, the outlines of churches, the crooked silhouettes of chimneys. For a moment, London felt less like a hostile machine and more like a vast, slumbering creature, with its heartbeat in the footsteps of those who refused to be erased. When dawn finally came, the cycle began again. Women returned to lodging houses, some with coins enough to eat, others with little more than exhaustion. Shawls were hung to dry, shoes removed, faces washed in cold water. The rooms filled with the soft rustle of fabric, the clink of coins on tables, the sighs of bodies surrendering to rest. Outside, the city awoke once more with bells, carts, and shouts, indifferent to the lives that had unfolded in its shadows. And yet those lives, though unrecorded in the ledgers of history, carried the city through its nights, sustaining it in ways unspoken. The city carried a rhythm that shaped every life within it. And for the women who walked its streets at night, that rhythm was a cycle of preparation, endurance, and recovery. Each day began with the search for food and warmth. Coins earned the night before disappeared quickly into the hands of landlords, pawnbrokers, and bakers. Bread was bought stale because it was cheaper. A cup of tea without sugar was sipped slowly to make it last. Sometimes a woman would share her portion with another who had earned nothing, because hunger was easier to bear together than alone. These gestures of kindness, quiet and uncelebrated, bound women to one another with threads of solidarity. Survival was not a solitary act, but a communal one. The streets themselves offered strange companionships. Newsboys who shouted the days. Headlines often recognized the women by name, trading gossip in exchange for a smile or a coin. Costermongers sold bruised fruit cheaply, slipping extra apples into baskets when no one was watching. Coffee stall keepers, who lit their braziers at impossible hours, became guardians of sorts, providing warmth and conversation without judgment. In these relationships lay small fragments of normalcy, a reminder that prostitutes were part of the city's fabric, not outsiders but participants in its daily life. Their presence was as ordinary as chimney sweeps, as familiar as lamplighters, and as essential as the carriages that rattled over cobblestones. Policing remained unpredictable. Patrols swept through alleys and squares, arresting women for loitering, yet their actions were marked more by inconsistency than by law. Some officers turned blind eyes in exchange for favors, while others delighted in exercising authority. Arrest meant a night in a cold cell, followed by court appearances where women were shamed publicly. The label of common prostitute carried in official records, marking them for life in ways that no man ever endured for the same acts. This imbalance of power was sharp and bitter, yet women found ways to endure it. Bribes were arranged quietly, alliances formed with sympathetic officers, and strategies developed for avoiding patrols. Knowledge of which streets were safest and which corners carried risk passed quickly through their circles like a shared secret. Disease was an ever-present specter. Syphilis in particular haunted the streets, spreading with a cruelty that medicine could not yet cure. Newspapers sensationalized it, Parliament debated it, and moralists used it as proof of women's corruption. Yet men, who spread it just as freely, faced no such condemnation. Women whispered about remedies, vinegar, alum, herbs, and prayers, but few found real relief. Block hospitals offered treatment, but demanded humiliation. Women submitted to examinations that stripped them of dignity, often conducted not for healing, but for control. The injustice of it was sharp, but resistance was difficult in a society that considered them both criminals and contagions. Still, women endured. Their resilience forged in the refusal to disappear. There were moments of softness even in these harsh realities. In lodging houses, women sat together in the evenings, patching clothes, sharing bread, and telling stories that transformed suffering into something bearable. They imitated the swagger of drunken sailors, laughed at the pompous accents of wealthy clients, and teased one another about the smallest victories. Laughter, though brief, became a shield. It was a way of insisting that life still held joy, that their identities were more than the shame imposed upon them. These moments reminded them that they were not merely surviving, but living. With humor and courage stitched into the fabric of their days, children remained central to many of their thoughts. Some women sent their babies to live with wet nurses. In the country, paying dearly for care they could barely afford. Others raised children in lodging houses, rocking them to sleep in corners while preparing themselves for the night ahead. The cries of infants mixed with the laughter of women and the noise of the city, forming a soundtrack of resilience. To love and protect a child under such conditions was an act of defiance, a refusal to let hardship extinguish tenderness. Women treasured these bonds fiercely, finding in them a reason to endure. The city itself mirrored their contradictions. Grand buildings rose above narrow alleys. Theaters glittered while tenements crumbled, and wealth brushed shoulders with poverty. On every street, women occupied the space between visible and invisible at once. They stood beneath the same gas lamps that lit the way for respectable families. But their shadows carried different meanings. They were condemned by the very society that depended on their existence, shunned in daylight yet sought after by night. This paradox was inescapable, but it was also a truth they carried with quiet strength in quieter hours when the fog thickened and footsteps grew scarce. The city revealed a softer face. The Thames reflected pale light, its surface broken only by the ripple of barges. Church bells tolled across the rooftops, marking time with steady calm. Women walked through these moments with shawls pulled tight, their bodies weary, but their senses attuned to every sound. There was danger, but also beauty. The silence felt sacred, a reminder that the city was not only a place of cruelty, but also of endurance, and that their lives, however harsh, were part of something larger than themselves. When dawn returned, it brought the familiar cycle. Women laid down their coins, washed in cold water, unpinned their hair, and surrendered to sleep. Outside, London bustled into its day as though nothing had happened, indifferent to the lives carried through its nights. Yet those lives mattered. They sustained the city, filled its silence, and bore the weight of contradictions that history too often refused to record. In their footsteps, their laughter, their hunger, and their resilience, the city's true heart continued to beat. Evenings in London had a peculiar glow, not from stars that were too often hidden by smoke, but from the steady hiss of gas lamps that lined the streets. Their light fell unevenly, leaving pockets of shadow where anything might be hidden. Prostitutes learned how to step between these spaces with care, presenting themselves where the glow was soft enough to flatter and dark enough to disguise. A shawl adjusted in lamplight became a signal. A smile offered at the edge of shadow became an invitation. Every detail mattered, and every movement carried calculation. This was not a trade conducted carelessly, but a craft that demanded constant awareness of light, mood, and danger. The taverns along the Thames filled quickly once work ended for the day. Sailors carried the scent of salt and tar, their voices booming as they ordered gin with hands still callous from ropes. Dock workers spoke in accents thick with river slang, laughing loudly at stories retold 100 times. Clerks arrived more quietly, their coats neat but their eyes tired, looking for a release from ledgers and figures. In each of these spaces, women threaded themselves like shadows among the noise, always alert, always reading the room. They stood near counters, leaned against door frames, or sat at tables when invited, listening to the tones of voices, the weight of coins in hands, the shift of posture that revealed more than words. Not every encounter began with lust. Many began with loneliness. A man spoke of a wife left behind in the countryside. Another admitted fear before a voyage. A clerk whispered of debts that haunted him like specters. Women listened with patience, offering sympathy without judgment. The city did not often allow men to confess weakness, but here under dim light. And with anonymity, words flowed more freely. Listening became as valuable as touch, and many women perfected this art. They became keepers of secrets, holding confessions close and releasing them only into silence once the men had gone. Remain an undercurrent, as steady as the river itself. Some men arrived already drunk, their hands clumsy, their tempers unpredictable. Others sought cruelty for its own sake, treating women as extensions of their frustrations. Women responded with strategies. Some carried pins hidden in sleeves, sharp enough to bring a man to his senses with a sting. Others relied on alliances, arranging to meet clients near corners where friends waited. There were tavern keepers who quietly watched, intervening when tempers grew dangerous, and there were stall holders who pretended not to see until they were needed. This web of silent vigilance made survival possible, though never certain. The city's contradictions grew sharper in brothels, where luxury and exploitation lived side by side. Within those houses, rooms were lit by candles, curtains heavy with dust and perfume, mirrors cracked but polished enough to reflect a shimmer of wealth. Madams controlled everything: the clothing, the schedules, the earnings. Some women valued the consistency. There was food, heat, and shelter. Others felt trapped, preferring the uncertainty of the streets where at least their choices belonged to them. Brothels offered safety from weather and some protection from police, but the cost was autonomy, and autonomy, even in fragments, was a form of dignity that many refused to surrender. Disease crept through both brothel and street. Syphilis scarred faces, stole sight, and carried slow death. Gonorrhea brought pain that lingered for years. Consumption hollowed lungs until breath came ragged and shallow. Remedies were whispered, shared in confidence like recipes for survival. Vinegar, alum, herbal washes, and charms were carried in pockets. Doctors were distrusted, hospitals feared. Women relied on one another more than on institutions, trusting in advice passed quietly between friends. It was not science that kept them alive so much as community, resilience, and the stubborn will to endure. Children remained both joy and burden. Some women brought them into taverns, holding infants while negotiating with clients, their presence a reminder of the stakes of survival. Others arranged for neighbors to watch them, paying with coins earned the night before. Many sent them away to wet nurses in the countryside, visiting when possible with parcels of bread, ribbons, or secondhand toys. These reunions, though brief, sustained women in ways that coins could not. To see a child smile, to feel a small hand clutching tightly, to hear laughter that carried no judgment. These moments gave strength to face the night again. The streets were alive with sound. Horses snorted as carriages rattled over cobblestones. Music spilled from dance halls, violins scratching out reels while feet stamped in time. Newsboys shouted headlines about scandals and crimes, their voices carrying over the din. And above, it all was the constant murmur of voices negotiating, laughing, shouting, whispering. The city was not quiet even in its darkest hours. It hummed with restless energy, a reminder that beneath the grand facades and respectable avenues lay a ceaseless hunger for distraction, company, and escape. Women provided all three, even as they bore the cost of judgment. The hypocrisy of society was impossible to ignore. Men who condemned prostitutes from pulpits sought them in private. Politicians who passed laws against them were whispered to. Be clients themselves. Newspapers that printed sermons on morality also sold stories filled with salacious detail, profiting from the very scandals they decried. Women lived at the center of this contradiction, punished for their existence, yet relied upon for the city's hidden needs. They carried this weight silently, transforming shame into resilience, turning condemnation into survival. When dawn approached, fatigue settled over the city. Women returned to lodging houses, their steps slower, their shoulders heavy. Shawls were drawn tightly, shoes slipped off with sighs, hair unpinned and combed with fingers too tired to bother with care. Coins were counted on tables, divided into piles for rent, coal, and food. Faces were washed in basins of cold water, and sleep came quickly, unceremonious, pressing down on bodies that had endured another night. Outside, bells rang, carriages rolled, and London returned to its daily routine as if the lives lived in its shadows were invisible. Yet those lives carried the city through its nights, shaping it in ways history seldom remembered, weaving resilience, sorrow, and quiet strength into its very foundation. The mornings after long nights brought with them a heaviness that was difficult to shake. Bodies ached from standing for hours on cobblestones, feet blistered inside worn shoes, and voices were rough from laughter forced too loudly in taverns or whispers stretched too softly in alleyways. Many women awoke in rooms with little air and less comfort, rising from mattresses stuffed with straw that crackled under their weight. Curtains rarely covered windows, and the pale London light crept in uninvited, revealing cracked plaster and damp stains that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Yet even in these conditions, small rituals persisted. Water was splashed on tired faces, hair combed into neatness, shawls folded carefully, and coins laid in rows as though order itself could offer reassurance. Survival was not just about enduring the night, but about reassembling dignity each morning. The city outside their doors wasted no time in reminding them of its demands. Landlords knocked for rent, sometimes politely, sometimes with fists that rattled thin doors. Pawnbrokers opened their shops, ready to take in garments, shoes, or keepsakes in exchange for a few pennies that could stretch a day further. Markets stirred with the cries of hawkers. The smell of roasting chestnuts mingled with coal smoke, while the bleating of goats driven through narrow lanes joined the noise of carts. Women stepped into this bustle with practiced caution, their eyes lowered to avoid confrontations, their hands clutched tightly around coins or baskets. Respectable women often crossed the street to avoid them, while men who had been clients only hours earlier hurried past with eyes fixed ahead, pretending not to recognize them. The contradiction was sharp, but it was also ordinary. Hypocrisy was the currency of the city, and they learned to live with it. During daylight, many turned to quieter forms of work. Some sewed by windows, piecing together garments for shops that paid too little but offered legitimacy. Others washed laundry until their hands reddened and cracked, the smell of soap clinging to their clothes long after. A few took in mending, repairing shirts or darning stockings for neighbors who pretended not to notice their other lives. These tasks, though exhausting, provided cover. To be seen working in daylight was to claim a place in society, however. Fragile, it was a shield against suspicion, an argument against the ever-present risk of being labeled and condemned. Meals were simple and uncertain. Bread, often stale, was softened with tea. Cheese, if fortune allowed, added richness to an otherwise meager table. Oysters, cheap and plentiful, were eaten in taverns where men and women mingle freely. These meals were not about indulgence, but about fuel. Hunger was a constant shadow, dulling the senses and sharpening the edges of despair. Yet sharing food softened its bite. A loaf divided between 3 women felt like a feast compared to one, eaten alone. The act of sharing was as nourishing as the bread itself, a reminder that they were not entirely abandoned to hardship. Illness crept in silently, carried in coughs, fevers, and infections that spread quickly in crowded lodgings. A sore throat could linger into consumption, a small cut could turn septic, and venereal disease haunted nearly every conversation. Remedies were improvised: vinegar washes, herbal teas, poultices made from bread and milk. Some women relied on midwives, or wise women who offered treatments without judgment. Others placed their faith in charms, prayers, or rituals that promised protection. Hospitals and charitable institutions offered little comfort. The Contagious Diseases Acts placed blame squarely on women, subjecting them to humiliating examinations and branding them as threats to public health. Men walked free, unmarked by the same stigma. The injustice was sharp, and yet women bore it silently, refusing to surrender even when their bodies betrayed them. Amid these hardships, humor remained essential. In shared rooms, women mimicked the swagger of wealthy clients, exaggerated their accents, and laughed until tears ran down their cheeks. They teased one another about crooked shawls or clumsy shoes, turning embarrassment into entertainment. Even police officers became subjects of ridicule, their pompous warnings transformed into jokes whispered behind their backs. Laughter, fleeting though it was, became a weapon against despair. It proved that they were more than victims, more than the name society called them. It kept their spirits alive when everything else conspired to break them down. Children added another layer of meaning to their days. Mothers balanced babies on hips while boiling tea, hushed toddlers in corners of lodging houses, and tucked them under blankets at night before stepping out into the streets. Those who could not keep children with them arranged for care, paying dearly to send them to wet nurses or neighbors. Visits were rare but cherished, each reunion a moment of joy that outweighed countless nights of hardship. A child's laugh, the feel of small arms around a neck, the sight of a ribbon tied in hair. These fragments of tenderness sustained women in ways that no amount of coin ever could. They reminded them of the stakes of their endurance, of the lives they fought to keep alive, even when their own were consumed by exhaustion. The nights returned with the same rhythm, each one both familiar and unpredictable. Taverns filled with noise and smoke, the smell of gin sharpened the air. Music drifted from dance halls where fiddles played reels for crowds eager to forget their labors. Carriages clattered along cobblestones, their wheels splashing through puddles. Women moved through this chaos with practiced grace, their eyes scanning faces, their bodies poised between invitation and caution. Each encounter carried possibility: kindness, cruelty, hunger satisfied, or hunger deepened. They never knew which the night would bring, and yet they stepped into it again and again, because choice was not luxury but necessity. And when dawn came once more, the cycle began again. Shawls were hung to dry, coins counted, faces washed, and bodies surrendered to rest. The city continued as though none of it existed, its attention fixed on industry, politics, and progress. Yet beneath that surface lay the lives of women whose footsteps and voices carried London through its nights. Lives filled with resilience, humor, and quiet strength. They endured not because the city was kind, but because they refused to disappear, even on the nights when the fog lay heavy across the river and the lamps seemed to dim under its weight. The women of London still stepped into the streets because absence meant hunger. They carried themselves with practiced poise, balancing weariness against necessity. Shawls tightened around shoulders, eyes alert for danger and opportunity alike. The city never truly slept. Carriages rumbled past, their wheels clattering against stone. Dogs barked in alleys. Voices drifted from taverns where fiddles played and boots stamped in rhythm. Within this constant hum, the women's presence was both ordinary and essential, though society pretended otherwise. They moved between corners, doorways, and meeting places, each step measured, each glance a negotiation between risk and reward. Taverns were both refuge and peril. Inside, warmth radiated from fires, smoke curled toward rafters, and the smell of spilled gin mingled with roasted meat. Laughter rose in waves, sometimes joyful, sometimes dangerous. Women entered cautiously, knowing that acceptance depended on mood. A smile from a sailor could lead to supper shared, while a scowl from a drunken clerk could end in insult or worse. They learned how to read these rooms with precision, noticing details others overlooked. The trembling hand that betrayed fear, the clenched jaw that foreshadowed temper, the generous gesture of a man eager to impress. Their survival depended on such instincts, sharpened by years of practice. Brothels told a different story. Behind curtained windows, music played softly, and madams orchestrated encounters with strict discipline. Women wore dresses finer than their own, borrowed from the house, their appearances polished to attract wealthier clients. Some found security there, a roof, a bed, and meals guaranteed, though freedom was scarce. Others chafed under the rules, preferring the risk of the streets to the control of another woman who demanded a share of their earnings. Each choice carried costs, yet the decision remained theirs, and even limited autonomy was prized in a world where so much was dictated by others. Disease continued to haunt their lives. Syphilis carved itself into faces, its marks a cruel advertisement of shame in a society eager to condemn. Gonorrhea spread pain silently, while fevers weakened bodies already strained by hunger and exhaustion. Remedies were whispered like secrets. Vinegar rinses, herbal brews, mustard poultices, and charms carried in pockets offered hope if not cure. Some women sought midwives, others trusted wise women whose knowledge passed quietly through generations. Doctors were rare, hospitals rarer still, and charity often demanded repentance before relief. Illness was endured as part of life, folded into the rhythm of survival without complaint, because there was no space for complaint. Children remained both burden and blessing. Their presence filled narrow rooms with laughter and cries, with small feet that padded across wooden floors and tiny hands that clutched shawls as tightly as life itself. Some women carried their babies while they worked, rocking them gently even as they whispered terms to clients. Others sent them to relatives or wet nurses, scraping together coins to pay for care. The reunions that followed were filled with tenderness. A child running into a mother's arms, a ribbon tied in hair, a sweet tucked into a pocket. These gestures outweighed every humiliation, every weary step. To keep a child alive was to defy the city's indifference, to insist that love still mattered even in places the world tried to forget. The law bore down with little mercy. Police patrolled alleys, quick to arrest for loitering, eager to make examples of women who had no power to resist. Courts labeled them as common prostitutes, branding them in records that never faded. The Contagious Diseases Acts deepened this cruelty, forcing examinations on women accused of spreading illness, while the men who visited them bore no consequence. These injustices were endured silently, resisted only through resilience and the quiet refusal to vanish. Some women paid bribes, others cultivated fragile alliances, but most relied on their own strength, knowing the law was not built for their protection, but for their punishment. And yet, life was not stripped entirely of joy. In the evenings before stepping out, women gathered together in rooms filled with the clatter of preparation. Brushes swept across dresses, rouge brightened tired cheeks, shawls were tied with practiced care. They laughed at each other's jokes, teased about crooked hems, and shared fragments of gossip. A woman who had earned well might buy bread or meat to share, and the meal became a small celebration. These moments of companionship gave the night a softer beginning, a reminder that they were not alone. Laughter, brief but genuine, echoed through halls that otherwise smelled of damp plaster and coal smoke. The city itself seemed to breathe with them. Fog wrapped buildings in mystery, lamps glowed like watchful eyes, and the river carried secrets beneath its surface. Bridges arched over water that reflected fragments of light, while churches stood solemn, their bells marking time without concern for those who lived in shadows. Against this backdrop, the women's footsteps became part of London's heartbeat. Steady, resilient, unacknowledged yet essential. They walked with dignity despite condemnation, carried humor despite sorrow, and wove their lives into the city's fabric in ways history too often chose to ignore. When dawn returned once more, the lamps dimmed, the fog lifted, and the cycle began again. Women unpinned their hair, washed in basins of cold water, counted coins, and laid down to rest. Outside, London surged into its day with carts, bells, and shouts, indifferent to the lives carried through its night. Yet within those unrecorded hours lay stories of endurance, tenderness, and resilience that defined the city as much as any grand building or celebrated name. Perhaps by now your body has grown heavy with rest, your eyes softened by the rhythm of voices and images that have carried you through the hidden hours of Victorian London, where women walked the streets beneath gas lamps and fog, not as the scandalous figures history painted, but as human beings who endured hunger, illness, laughter, tenderness, and the contradictions of a city that both condemned and depended on them. And as you imagine their shawls pulled close, their footsteps echoing softly against cobblestones, you might also sense the quiet resilience that threaded their lives together. Resilience found in the sharing of bread, in the laughter that broke through sorrow, in the care given to children and to one another. And though society turned its eyes away, their presence shaped London as surely as its bridges, bells, and chimneys. Now, in this stillness, their stories linger like faint lamplight at the edges of sleep, reminding us that survival itself can be a form of grace, that dignity can exist even in forgotten alleys, and that compassion, when remembered, allows us to see not fallen women, but lives filled with endurance, humor, and quiet humanity. So as you drift further into rest, let the images of shawls, lamplight, river mist, and laughter accompany you, soft as a lullaby, carrying you gently toward dreams where judgment has no place and only the calm rhythm of survival, tenderness, and silence remains.